God must be a season, Grandma said, looking out at the blizzard drowning her garden. My footsteps on the sidewalk, the smallest flights. Dear God, if you are a season, let it be the one I pass through to get here. Here. That's all I want it to be. I promise.
There are many things about Ocean Vuong's writing that don't need the kind of explaining of historical context that we've done with other poets in this class, because he is very much your contemporary. You are closer in age to Vuong than to anyone else we're reading in this course, and in many ways, Vuong's world is your world. Maybe you share Vuong's Vietnamese heritage, maybe your family emigrated from elsewhere, or you grew up speaking a language other than English. Or maybe you have a close friend who did. Vuong has a lively Instagram account and used to maintain a Tumblr and a blog when he was starting out. Night Sky with Exit Wounds was written around age 24, 25. With Vuong, as with Hayes and Brown and Rankin, we have caught up to the present in this course. Yet at the same time, Vuong's poetry is deeply fixated on the past, just as much as Seamus Heaney's or Robert Lowell's. And though Vuong's style differs from those writers in many ways, it shares an abiding fascination with the compresence of history and myth, and the violence enfolded in each within the personal problems of our private lives. Let's dig into that fascination together, starting with Vuong's poem Telemachus.
Telemachus. Like any good son, I pull my father out of the water, drag him by his hair through white sand, his knuckles carving a trail the waves rush in to erase. Because the city beyond the shore is no longer where we left it. Because the bombed cathedral is now a cathedral of trees. I kneel beside him to see how far I might sink. Do you know who I am, Ba? But the answer never comes. The answer is the bullet hole in his back, brimming with seawater. He is so still, I think he could be anyone's father. Found the way a green bottle might appear at a boy's feet, containing a year he has never touched. I touch his ears. No use. I turn him over to face it. The cathedral in his sea-black eyes. The face not mine, but one I will wear to kiss all my lovers goodnight. The way I seal my father's lips with my own and begin the faithful work of drowning.
Let's imagine that you don't know the title to this poem. What would you think is going on? From the start, Vuong narrates a remarkable attempt at life-saving, as though it's a matter of course. That phrase, like any good son, doesn't prepare us for the intensity of the deed that follows. The situation, at first, goes unexplained. Why is the father in the water, dead or nearly dead? Why must the speaker pull him by the hair, rather than some other way? Notice the accumulation of grace notes here. The white sand, the language of art and destruction, and those verbs, carve, erase, used to describe the motion of the father's hands. The poem offers as partial explanation scenes of displacement, warfare, and destruction. Son and father have both moved from city to country, fleeing violence of some kind. The poem takes an interest in verticality, cathedral of trees, how far I might sink. The speaker's attempt to see if the father is alive takes the form of a freighted question, presupposing recognition, admission, descent, memory, consciousness. But the father's violent death precludes a resolution. There's an old legal phrase that runs, "The father is always uncertain." And that's true here, too. Empty, weathered, like a container of bygone things. You might compare the imagery here with the ship in a bottle in the poem Immigrant Haibun. Notice how the sentences get shorter at this point in the poem. I touch his ears. No use. I turn him over to face it. And then lengthens ever so slightly again. The cathedral in his sea-black eyes. It's the heights and depths in the reflection in the father's face that remind the speaker of his descent, in terms of both space and heredity. What he inherits from his father is the imperative to make drowning, dying, a sort of project, despite and through the personal work of love alongside that project. Now, think of the title. Who is Telemachus? The son of Odysseus, hero of the Odyssey, who goes searching for traces of his long-lost father years after the war he left to fight in, cannot find him, but ultimately reunites with him successfully in their homeland of Ithaca. There's no such success here. Vuong isn't retelling the Odyssey so much as derailing it, to devastating effect. You think that the title promises a happy ending? Think again. Night Sky with Exit Wounds fuses myth and the contemporary world, the personal and the public, the biographical with the social. It wears its illusions lightly, simultaneously welcoming a deeply read audience, and an audience that may have read very little, or maybe listening rather than reading. The language embraces dream texture with an urgency both violent and sensual. Sense evocation takes precedence over normal logic. Have you noticed how many of these poems begin with scenarios and verbal postures somewhere on the border of memory and dream? To borrow another poet's term, they're dream songs, where dream always carries its double nightmare alongside it. Violence lies at the center of this book's attention, together with the contrasting intensity of parental and romantic love, both of which find verbal form in language evoking violence or harm. Crush, hobble, cripple, sear, snap, burn, kill. Night Sky often refers to the world of Greek myth and the Trojan cycle in particular in several of its titles. Telemachus, Trojan, Eurydice, Odysseus Redux. And Vuong has spoken in interviews about the importance of the Trojan War to his poetry. In a 1923 essay titled Ulysses, Order, and Myth, T.S. Eliot coined the phrase mythic method to describe what his contemporaries Joyce and Yeats were doing in their writing, creating modern works of art using myth as a replacement for the structure supplied by conventional narrative. And earlier this semester, we mentioned Kathy Park Hong's 2014 essay, Delusions of Whiteness in the Avant-Garde, which voices frustration with the tendency of avant-garde writing, including the tradition growing out of high modernists like Eliot, to value disembodiment and abstraction in a way that can denigrate as sentimental or identitarian discussion of issues like race and racism, gender and sexuality, ableism and disability. Hong calls in that essay for an avant-garde unafraid to address these topics straight on. Vuong is part of a tradition of American minority writers seeking to retailor the modernist mythic method to the purpose of addressing the experience of having a body outside norms of race or sexuality. Gwendolyn Brooks's In the Mecca, which we read earlier this semester, unfurls a tapestry of Black American life at mid-century, borrowing structures from Dante and Chaucer, and language and images from all three Abrahamic faiths. Walcott's Omeros, which we talked about last week and read alongside his poems, reassembles Homer into a fragmented Caribbean epic, cast in Shakespearean language and Dante's meter. Vuong has also cited as an influence the writer Teresa Ha-kyung Cha's experimental narrative Dictée, which frames a Korean matrilineal history through invocations to each of the Greek muses. And Kathy Park Hong's own poem, Dance Dance Revolution, also aspires to epic form, drawing on the Aeneid, the Divine Comedy, and Pound's cantos along the way. Vuong handles the Trojan War in a way that we might call typological. For most people, the term typology refers to a medieval mode of textual and scriptural interpretation in which events echo and rhyme in mutually supportive meaning across different points in the fullness of time. For example, in the Bible, the death of Abel, the sacrifice of Isaac, the sufferings of Job all prefigure the archetype of the death of Jesus. Even now, a soft form of typological thinking is rarely far from us. Think of how we always reach for historical precursors to make sense of present moments. Vuong sees the Trojan War as a type of violence whose imagery recurs through literature as literature attempts to represent the history around it. The destruction of cities, the centrality of sexual violence, the scattering of nations and families by war. Troy is a type. Vietnam is a type. Every war is an instance, equally epic and equally devastating, of that same song born anew. Vuong realizes and casts a lyric structure aimed to express how from that recurrent violence arise the intensities of personal emotional lives. Love and its failures and complications in families and between lovers. The book's most cited line may be the blunt, unsentimental prose assessment of his genealogy in the poem Notebook Fragments.
An American soldier fucked a Vietnamese farm girl, thus my mother exists, thus I exist, thus no bombs equals no family, no me. Yikes.
Yikes. Vuong's father, whom he figures as Odysseus, is held not by Calypso or Circe, but rather old mental and physical wounds. His mother tells him, "When they ask you where you're from, tell them your name was fleshed from the toothless mouth of a war woman." And of love, the poet writes, "I just don't know how to love a man gently. Tenderness, a thing to be beaten into." The figure of the soldier of love, Miles Amoris, goes back to Roman love elegy. Vuong here resurrects it into a fresh and newly disturbing figure, love mediated through the intergenerational traumas of the atrocity of modern mechanized warfare. Vuong's life, with its Cinderella-ish arc, has become almost as famous as his work, and many read life and work as tightly intertwined, even against the occasional protestation of Vuong himself. Vuong was born in 1988 outside of Saigon, Vietnam. His grandmother had grown up farming rice there. Shortly thereafter, his family of 7 fled Vietnam. When many Americans think of Vietnamese refugees, they think of the American withdrawal from the Vietnam War in the 70s, but long conflicts with Cambodia and China, as well as internal strife and persecution, continued to send people out of the country as refugees into the early 1990s. After spending some time in a refugee camp in the Philippines, where the photo on the cover of Night Sky was taken, Vuong's family was resettled in Hartford, Connecticut. Vuong's father, whose absence haunts much of Night Sky, ended up in prison, a fact alluded to in one of his poems. His mother divorced him soon thereafter, and Vuong describes himself proudly as raised by women. He spoke only Vietnamese till entering kindergarten in the nearby town of Glastonbury, and early schooling was a hardship. Vuong was the first in his family to learn to read, and struggled with reading till 6th grade. Dyslexia runs between generations in his family. His 4th grade teacher was shocked to find that a student who could barely complete normal English homework had, on one occasion, written an eloquent poem about flowers. borrowing language from a children's book on Martin Luther King Jr., as he describes in an essay. People rarely describe Vuong as a New England writer, but I think it's important to do so, just as much as we do Dickinson or Frost or Wallace Stevens, and especially as a writer of Connecticut, an unsentimental, working-class, post-industrial Connecticut few students at Yale, myself included, see much of, though it's less than an hour's drive away. Vuong grew up near a shuttered Colt gun factory, not dissimilar to the old Winchester one at the end of Mansfield Street in New Haven, just north of the Whale, and my apartment. He biked to work on a tobacco farm as a teenager, the best work available. He writes in his poetry and his highly successful novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, about the macho masculinity of the boys he grew up around, and the substance abuse and the incipient opioid epidemic. Vuong came out to his family at age 17. He had literally packed his bags in anticipation of backlash, but the backlash didn't come, and his mother reacted warmly. He started community college at Glastonbury Community College the following year, intending to study business or marketing, but grew disenchanted with what he saw as the many lies he felt compelled to tell. A professor introduced him to the idea of studying English, which he hadn't previously realized one could study, and he threw himself into it. After transferring to Brooklyn College in New York, he began to befriend a number of writers and poets, including Said Jones, Eduardo C. Corral, and Ricky Laurentiis. He took classes from the writer Ben Lerner, then teaching at Brooklyn College, who says he just gave Vuong as many books as possible and then got out of the way. In college, he also met his partner, Peter Bienkowski, who is an important presence, particularly at the close of Night Sky with Exit Wounds. Vuong's grandmother, Le Thibai, passed away in 2008, an event which seems to have catalyzed his creative life. After his family returned from burying her in Vietnam, Vuong soon began to perform at readings and to publish poetry in small journal after small journal, often in queer or Asian-specific venues and circles, the kind of humble start every young writer hopes will lead to a career breakthrough. During this time, he nursed his landlady in place of paying rent and worked at a Panera. He published a first chapbook in 2010 titled Burnings. He graduated from college in 2012 and released a second chapbook, No, the following year. So even as recognition accrued, check out Vuong's 2012 reading at Queer Apple in New York. He just absolutely electrifies the audience. So poetry does not pay many bills, and Vuong entered the MFA program at NYU in 2014, partly for the financial sustenance. In that program, he worked with the poets Yusuf Komunia Ka, whose influence on Vuong I find especially fascinating, and Sharon Olds. That same year, the manuscript of Night Sky won an open competition held by Copper Canyon Press, and Vuong won the Poetry Foundation's Ruth Lilly Prize. A first serial from the book, the poem Someday I'll Love Ocean Vuong, ran in the New Yorker in April, and Night Sky won broad acclaim when it appeared a year later, just before Vuong's graduation. Surely one of the more remarkable string of publication coups during an MFA program ever. Attention to Vuong's poetry was greatly bolstered by the publication last year of his novel On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, which shares its title with a poem in Night Sky, a novel which many of you have probably read. Publication was swiftly followed by a MacArthur grant in the fall of last year, making it fair to call Vuong one of the most laureled writers of our generation, certainly his age. And I say our generation because Vuong is only 10 to 14 years older than most of you, and only 2 years older than me. When Vuong was your age, just a decade ago, he was scribbling poems after Panera shifts and performing them at tiny readings. Maybe, in another 10 years, someone like me will be lecturing about you in a modern and contemporary poetry class. Yes, you. This is the second full collection of poetry we're reading this term, and I'd like to take the occasion to think in terms of volumes, how poets arrange their poems into books, and how to make sense of those arrangements. Vuong says that during those difficult years in a shabby Brooklyn apartment, he taped drafts of his poems on the walls, constantly revising possible sequences for the chapbooks and what became Night Sky. The first poem, Threshold, through its title, invites us to see this book as a house or a building, the domestic space within which family life, private life unfolds. A potent metaphor for a poet whose life has involved displacement and precarity. It also emphasizes that every boundary can be crossed, living and dead, masculine and feminine, mythic and contemporary. The speaker experiences his own body as an alien in disadvantaged state and sees a male ghost in falling water, draped in guitar strings and singing. In other words, a modern vision of Orpheus and his lyre. The figure of Orpheus recurs throughout this collection, and you've also seen him in the hands of many other poets this term, including Ashbery, Gunn, and Walcott. The song awakens the speaker to the potential power of poetry, to the fact of his own living. His father seems not to understand, but it's also possible his father was part of that Orpheus figure. This song that he hears initiates the speaker into the world of verse, imagined as space, entering a song in which the speaker gets lost, rather like the pilgrim at the beginning of the Divine Comedy. The speaker of Night Sky, too, traffics between the worlds of living and dead in a kind of exile, more aware of life because he's haunted by death. After crossing the threshold, Night Sky presents three sections, which we could broadly describe as a first section, largely focused on the poet's parents and their story. A second section on young adulthood and the poet's personal and sexual awakening and independence. And a third section, in which the speaker negotiates an adult relationship with his parents, Vietnam, and love. Together, these comprise a kind of sonata form, ABA. Night Sky uses a variety of verse forms, but a finite variety with internal recurrence. How can we describe these? Vuong avoids any normal English rhyme or regular meter, preferring looser structures and symmetries, often with a striking visual appearance, almost like word sculpture. He has said in interviews that his line breaks, at least in his early poetry, grew out of imagining collaborative poetic creation with his recently deceased grandmother, including the speech rhythms and tones of Vietnamese. In his public readings, Vuong, who, as you've heard, has an unmistakable reading voice and performance style, emphasizes his line breaks audibly and scrupulously. We might categorize the verse forms of Night Sky this way. There are poems composed of winding lines that snake across the page, like Trojan. There are stichic poems, where line follows line without breaks. There are poems in couplets without indentation, then poems that have indented couplets, poems where lines alternate in left and right alignment. There are several poems in prose or mixed prose with verse, which people call prosametra. And there are a few one-off experiments. 3-line stanzas, stanzas are 5 or 6 very short lines with alternating indentation, and some others. And there are 2 poems in collages of forms. In general, the sense of rhythmic and formal variation matters a lot to Vuong. Like forms seldom repeat in succession, but with 2 exceptions. Early on, in part 1, Trojan and Obad with Burning City, both winding forms. Later, at the end of part 2, Untitled Rothko and Queen Under the Hill, both stichic, though with distinct line lengths. Both these sets reach out to the poems around them, creating transitions between the worlds of mythic allusion and contemporary history. Let's look at the first as an example of how poems in sequence can color one another. Section 1 begins with Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, but the poem gives us a failed homecoming and a failed reunion, as we've mentioned, a son failing to save the life of his drowned father and in the process becoming like him. The sequence then moves to Trojan, which obliquely recalls the Trojan hero Hector, whom the Iliad calls breaker of forces, as well as Achilles, before the Iliad dressed as a woman in order to avoid going to war at Troy. These visions slide into allusions to the Trojan horse, belly full of blades and brutes, adopting the language of pregnancy in Virgil's telling of the episode, and then the impending fall of Troy. The sequence then applies that vision of the aestheticized destruction of a city to the American evacuation of Saigon as White Christmas plays in the streets. That line, "when the city burns," becomes the chiaroscuro of a city burning against the verbal texture of physically absent snow. In the next poem, Closer to the Edge, the fall of Saigon, during which Vuong's mother had still been a small child, transitions, a generation later, into a sexual encounter between the speaker's father and mother in a bomb crater. The speaker invokes both parents as teachers for understanding physical desire and moments in time. Father, foreshadow, mother, minute hand. We've transitioned across these 4 poems, from myth and myth to history and history, and also, chiastically, from the personal to the impersonal, then the impersonal back to the personal. Retaining the same form across those central 2 poems in the unit helps capture the congruence of myth time with history time. It's worth noting at this point that throughout this collection, recurring words and images can have an incantatory and labyrinthine effect, similar to the non-sequential recurrence of versed forms. Trying to trace the reuses and reappearances of keywords as they materialize and vanish creates a sustained ghostliness, not just a series of poems, but a sequence of hauntings connected by preoccupations and family resemblances. Vuong embraces repetition where other poets flee. He has certain fixed ideas here, and leans on them to unify the aesthetic vision on the level of the volume. The collection's interests in recurrence of both myths and words fuse in the poem Odysseus Redux, where the poet's father once again returns in the figure of a complicated, not straightforward Odysseus figure. He entered my room like a shepherd, stepping out of a Caravaggio. Notice the posture of dream recounting here, the blurring of reality with art, image with text. The illusion in that simile isn't necessary to making sense of the poem. I'd hate for any of you to come away feeling like reading Ocean Vuong is entirely a game of catching illusions. In so many ways, he's quite the opposite, but it thickens it. The most famous shepherds in Caravaggio are in a painting that depicts the adoration of Christ, leaned over the infant in awe. All that remains of the sentence is a line of black hair stranded at my feet. What is the sentence in question? The first sentence of the poem? A sentence said by the he who entered? It's unclear. In the kind of dreamlike gesture so common in Vuong's poems, that sentence, an immaterial thing, transmutes into hair, a material thing. Normally, people leave hair, not sentences. The sentence is being figured as a living being here, with hair to drop. Note the abruptness of those 3 monosyllable lines, which recall each other, and other very short lines which also anchor the poem. The participle stranded, which seems to grow out of the idea strand of hair, finds visual expression in the stranding of those short lines on the page. Look at my feet, totally separated from anything else. Back from the wind, he called to me. Notice what's going on syntactically here. Wind is referred to as if it's a place or destination, as though the he, our Odysseus, went to the wind in the first place. But the wind is not such a thing. Vuong is skilled at these confusions and blurrings of category through syntax, a talent he shares with writers like the surrealist Edmond Chabès, whom he cites in Immigrant Haibun, and Ashbery, who, he says, had an emancipatory effect on his imagination when he first read him. This gets followed with a hard turn into the surreal. He called to me with a mouthful of crickets, intense figurative language for a non-verbal sound, as well as a nightmare image, opening the possibility of punishment or torture. These images hover, partly aligning in the middle of the page, leading to more synesthesia. Smoke and jasmine rising from his hair. Smell, sound, all vivid and unsettling. The image is of a man, battered, unintelligible, and speechless. Uncomfortable, but not without an element of allure, that jasmine in there. Vuong works multiple pauses, 4 line breaks, 2 stanza breaks, into the next triply enjambed sentence, acting out the waiting that it describes. I waited for the night to wane into decades before reaching for his hands. We are in a timeless arena, punctuated with a category violation of our habitual expectation. Night wanes into dawn, a time of day, not decades, an interval of time. Of course, abandonment and neglect are also violations of expectations, and that imparts special verbal force to this depiction of that decades-long experience in this single dream vision. Interaction gets figured as shadow play, an unconscious dance. Then we danced, without knowing it, my shadow deepening his on the shag. Notice the spatial arrangement implied here. The speaker needs to have his back to the light source while looking at the Odysseus figure, but they need to be close enough for their shadows to touch. There also needs to be moonlight, a street lamp, or flickers of dawn, some light source, to make the shadows possible. And sure enough, the next line, outside, the sun kept rising, which comes as news to us since it's not clear that it is rising earlier than this point in the poem. One of its red petals fell through the window. Vuong figures the sun as a flower and its beams as petals, an unorthodox metaphor for light that Vuong might well have innovated entirely. And following through on the metaphor requires a violation of sense. That petal needs to cross through glass. When it does, it caught on his tongue. Again, images of mouths unable to speak. I tried to pluck it out, he says. Notice again the enjambment and orphaning of that curt string of monosyllables on the page. The verbal echo here seems to be biblical, from Matthew 5:29. And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. Vuong is a practicing Buddhist, but he's written about his extensive time in Black Baptist churches throughout childhood. That passage makes clear the it in question is ambiguous. Is it the petal or is it the tongue? This violent image connects to a long lineage of tongues torn out in poems, which I won't delve into here, but the speechlessness and the inability to snatch off the petal leads to the realization that the Odysseus figure is the speaker's self, a possibility he has wrestled with through all of Night Sky, including that first poem, Telemachus, repulsed by the prospect of becoming like his father, inheriting violence, like the gun passed down in the poem Always and Forever, yet also unable to let him go entirely. My own face, the mirror, its cracking, the crickets, every syllable spilling through. All those 2-word phrases lilt toward one more visually stranded closure. Visual recognition of oneself as an echo of one's father results in a metaphor shift. The mouthful of crickets now serves as a metaphor for speech. They pour out like syllables, as in a poem, this poem, bursting with hopping things. Odysseus returns, and Telemachus recognizes himself as Odysseus's heir. But here, there's no comfort in that realization. Vuong probes at the edges of an old myth for its challenges and ellipses, how having an absent, war-wounded father might be difficult for a son, might simultaneously elude and generate speech. This is the particular magic of Vuong at his best. The present world and personal memory, in all their horror and richness, arrive at the stature and strangeness of legend.